It was on the cover of the New York Times International Edition. The headline read, "Jack Daniels embraces a hidden ingredient, help from a slave." The photo was of Jack Daniels surrounded by his leadership, and to his immediate right is a black man. But when you looked at the original photo, not just the cropped photo that the New York Times used, he actually ceded the center position to the black man. So the question became, who was that man? You can go to any bourbon distillery in Kentucky. Rest assured, their distillers were African American. And we don't know a single face, we don't know a single name. Jack Daniel wasn't trying to hide this person. He was trying to make sure America couldn't erase this person. This was not a story that was ever meant to be forgotten from American history. A story of love, honor, and respect. He cared about him. That's a level of trust.
Hey there, Lead the Team Nation. We have got an amazing interview coming your way, but something I've been looking forward to for a very long time with Fawn Weaver, who is the CEO and founder of Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey, the fastest growing American whiskey brand in U.S. history. And she is one of only 5 African-American women to found and lead a $1 billion company in U.S. history. And she's not only built a successful business, but also revived the legacy of Nearest Green, the formerly enslaved man who taught Jack Daniel the art of distilling. Her work is a testament to preserving and honoring history through entrepreneurship. And most recently, Fawn has made the New York Times bestseller list again, this time for her book, Love and Whiskey, The Remarkable True Story of Jack Daniel, his Master Distiller Nearest Green, and the Improbable Rise of Uncle Nearest. The book hit shelves on June 18th and has remained on the bestseller list for 7 weeks. Holy smokes, Fawn, welcome to Lead the Team.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
And y'all, just a testament again to Fawn here. I had technical difficulties and she was so flexible. So I really appreciate her willingness to come on and spend some time with us today for the second time.
Happy to do it.
Let's kick this off. Can you share a story from your leadership journey where you had to make a decision that ultimately strengthened your team and reinforced your company values?
I would say during COVID, when our industry began laying people off and furloughing very, very quickly into the period of quarantine. And it was an industry-wide thing. And I called the entire company together, every team member onto a Zoom call. And I said, I want you to let your families know your jobs are not in jeopardy. And we currently have 13 open positions, and I intend to fill every single one with the people that are being let go at the other companies, the superstars that are at the other companies. We're going to bring them into our company. And so we were hiring during quarantine and during COVID because I looked at it and I told the team, we will not make permanent decisions on a temporary problem. And this is, in fact, a temporary problem.
Wow. And so what did you notice when you communicated that message? How did your team respond?
Relieved. The thing that people don't understand is that your team, at least my team, but I believe that this to be all employees, what they need more than anything is to be secure. So people talk about belonging and people talk about all these other things, and all those things are important, but they all come below being secure. Because if a person is not secure in their job, if they don't know that their job is safe, they can't belong. So all the other things that you try to do to make them, to better company culture, to make people feel like they belong, none of that matters if they don't feel safe.
It all goes back to Maslow, right? The basic human needs. All these other things are nice. We want them. We want to be at self-actualization. I think it's the top of the pyramid. But taking care of security in a time of uncertainty in the world, that's a powerful leadership move.
It is.
Cool. Now, I got a lot of questions here. You have an amazing background, but take us back to what happened when you read the New York Times article that set a lot of this in motion.
It was one of the New York Times top 10 stories of that year. And so millions and millions of people read it around the world. My husband and I happened to be in Singapore at the time. We were only there for a few days, but it was on the cover of the New York Times International Edition. The headline read, Jack Daniels embraces a hidden ingredient, help from a slave. And then the photo that was right beneath it, which was quite huge, the photo was a photo of Jack Daniels surrounded by his leadership, and to his immediate right is a Black man. And so that really stirred the imagination of the internet, especially social media. Why in the world in the 19th century, or at the very top of the 20th century, why would there have been a Black man seated to the right of Jack Daniel, and the only photo he ever took with his leadership team? The only photo he ever took with other people, actually. Why would he have allowed a Black man to sit next to him? That was the question. And who was the Black man? But when you looked at the original photo, not just the cropped photo that the New York Times used, but when you actually looked at the entire photo, which you can find online, it wasn't just that Jack Daniel had this Black man seated to the right of him. He actually ceded the center position to the Black man. So that meant that that person, whoever it was, no matter the race, was extraordinarily important to Jack Daniel, the most famous whiskey maker of all time, then and now. So the question became, who was that man?
That's an incredible story. And I can see where it hit social media. You're the only person that took the next step. Walk us through the next step.
Yeah.
Before you get there, everyone else is reading it. What about you, or why was that a call to action for you?
Well, I think that very, very quickly, within hours, the internet determined that the reason why this Black man wasn't known was because Jack Daniel was a slave owner. He stole the recipe from this particular slave and then hid him. And it was in the middle of 2016. It was June 2016. You'll remember that election. Both parties were using race as a wedge. And so you have, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, at that point, I was just about to turn 40 years old. At that time in my life, I hadn't seen our country so politically divided, so racially divided. Now, obviously, our prior generations, that had been the case, but I hadn't seen this in America in my lifetime. And I remember looking at this and going, that story doesn't vibe with this. That story doesn't make sense. Because if you're trying to hide a Black man in the 19th century, it wasn't hard. Don't put him in your photo.
Right. And there are other examples of where something like this did play out, right? And it was buried.
Well, listen, you can go to any bourbon distillery in Kentucky, and rest assured their distillers were African American. And we don't know a single face. We don't know a single name. And so this to me immediately said, wait a minute. Jack Daniel wasn't trying to hide this person. He was trying to make sure America couldn't erase this person. And so what I gathered very quickly in looking at this photo, then ordering Jack Daniel's Legacy, his only authorized biography, written in the height of the civil rights era, 1967 it was published. You have a white reporter named Ben Green, no relation whatsoever. You have a white reporter named Ben Green who travels from Tuscaloosa, Alabama to Lynchburg, Tennessee to write the authoritative biography of the most famous American whiskey maker ever. And he includes Nearest Green and his boys, Eli and George, by name more times than Jack Daniel's own family. So when you combine those two things together, that the people who were being interviewed for Jack's biography were his nephew, who he turned Jack Daniel Distillery over to 4 years before he passed away, then his great nephews, the four that had taken over the distillery by the time this was written. When you look at all of the people who were interviewed for that book were people who knew Jack, were very intimate with his nephew, worked at the distillery for decades. When you consider all of that, it became very clear to me that this was not a story that was ever meant to be erased or forgotten from American history, from Southern history. And so you have all of these stories between Blacks and whites in the South in Tennessee that none of them are positive when you go into the 19th century, when you go into the early 20th century, even middle of the 20th century. And yet, here was the story that I believed there was a chance that it was a story of love, honor, and respect. Because the only reason you would cede the center position of the only photo you've ever taken with other people to a Black man said to me, he cared about him. That's the first thing. Number two, if you actually look at that photo in Love and Whiskey, my book, it opens up with the full photo. The cropped photo that is on the front cover is essentially very close to what they had used in the New York Times, just a more cropped in version. But when you open up Love and Whiskey, one of the first things you will see is the full photo, that it is not cropped. And if you look closely, you will see that everyone in the photo is seated except for Jack Daniel. Jack never grew to be more than 5'2". Even though he wore lifts, he was a little like Prince. His lifts weren't as tall as Prince. Prince wore heels, but he wore lifts. And so he was a little taller. Maybe he was my height, 5'4". But what you'll notice is he's standing, everyone is seated. The reason he is standing is because he's using a cane on his right hand because his right leg had been amputated. So the positioning of Nearest Green's son, George Green, which is who is in that photo, and his nephew, Lem Motlow, who is seated in front of them, the positioning of those two men was to cover the fact that his leg had been amputated. That's a level of trust.
Wow. Okay. You're blowing my mind with this on that part of it. That's incredible. And just as a side note, my last name, a lot of my family, it's from Lincoln County.
Oh,
and
no way.
There are all these stories, which is Morris County is where you are, right? And the Jack Daniel distillery is, and where you're right. Am I correct? In the county next to.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of family stories about family members being involved with and learning from Jack Daniel in the whiskey and bourbon making. My family did not grow to be very famous. And I think there's just my grandfather had a story of, well, that family member who tried to start their own distillery ended up going broke. And that was because whiskey making was a sin.
Yeah.
Things like that.
But
Well, you know, worked out.
Yeah. That was definitely the story for a lot of people.
Yeah. But it's amazing to consider, hey, I might have had a family member that knew.
Yeah.
That knew him and could have been involved in that. But going back to your story here, so you read this, you get interested. The story that I understand is you show up in Tennessee and you start doing research there, and then you identify the land where they built the original still. Is that correct? And you end up purchasing the land and.
Yeah, I didn't go there for that purpose. I went there to do research. I thought that there is a really good chance that this was a story of love, honor, and respect. That's what I believed that it was. I could have been wrong, but I wanted to see if I was right. And I went there for my 40th birthday. That's where I chose to go for 4 days. My husband gave me 4 days to get in and get out. He wasn't fond of the name Lynchburg. So we got in there, but we weren't there for even hours before we met Jack Daniel's now eldest living descendant, who shared with us that the farm where Jack Daniel grew up, the Dan Call farm, where Nearest Green was the master distiller, we now know it was the home of the original Jack Daniel distillery, distillery number 7, where Nearest Green was and is the only known master distiller for distillery number 7. And so that property, including the home where Jack grew up, the entire second floor was a time capsule because the family who bought it in the 60s was afraid their daughter might fall out of the second floor balcony. So not only did they remove the second floor balcony, they completely cabined off the second floor. So by the time we got there to look at the property, the girls' bedroom that was upstairs, the walls had hand-painted roses, wallpaper, but a lot of that wallpaper had begun to peel. And behind it, as you know, during that period of time, when you are insulating the walls, what was used was newspaper. And every newspaper that was on the wall in that bedroom was either October 10th or October 11th, 1898. That was the last time that had been wallpapered. And so you had that in the girls' room. Then across the way in the boys' room, you had someone had been barrel stencil practicing on the walls, all over the walls. It said DH call sour mash corn whiskey spelled without an E, which meant that it was still spelt the way of his Scottish family that came out. That's how you spell Scotch, is without an E. That's how you spell whiskey without an E, is when you're talking about Scotch and Japanese whiskey, things like that. But that meant that preceded the time frame in which the brands that we knew about, either Jack Daniels or Daniel and Paul was one of the brands beforehand. It preceded all of that. And that was still on the walls. So it was not rocket science for my husband and I to buy that property, 313 acres. But now all of a sudden we went from planning to be there for 4 days, going back to Los Angeles to do research, to now we own one of the most historic properties in America and the most historic as it relates to an American whiskey brand.
Can people go see this property?
Only press, and we do legacy tours where we bring in top bartenders and beverage directors, retailers from all over the country, and we give them an 8-hour tour, and that is a part of that 8-hour tour. And I believe we're going to start rolling out something similar at the distillery later this year, where people will have that opportunity to do this tour. But up until this point, it's been closed to the public.
Wow, y'all, this is an amazing story. And check out our book, because there's a lot of other levels to this thing, and there's going to be a movie, I'm sure, in some way. So I'm trying to sort of distill, and maybe no pun intended, or maybe pun intended.
Or pun intended.
What about your mindset, people in your life? You read this article, you're willing to go. You go there, you purchase a property. You're making some very bold moves on a hunch or from reading something. And I'm just curious, like, how do you go about your day? Is this sort of, or is it nature versus nurture in terms of this entrepreneurial mindset?
This is normal for me. It is. It really is. Keith says that sometimes my thinking and acting are the same action. Okay. I tend to move forward with things when something is in my gut. I usually don't question it. If something is in my gut and the door opens, I'm going to go through that door. Now, if a door shuts, then that's what is supposed to happen. But what I don't want to do is stand on one side of a door wondering whether or not it will open for me, and what would happen if I step onto the other side. So I live a life of walking through a lot of open doors.
Wow. Okay. Do you have a favorite door, a favorite failure door? Like, hey, I try to go through this one. This one works.
Yeah, I don't look at failure as other people look at failure. I do not believe that failure exists in the traditional sense that we think of it. Meaning failure isn't failure unless you give up before you try. You nor I have ever met a person who failed that did not first give up. So it's not really the failure that exists. It is the giving up that does. And so for me, if a door is open, I'm going to walk through it. And if a subsequent door closes, I am then looking for the next open door.
That's interesting. Okay. Think about that. I think a lot of people, you just went on a hunch and you felt inspired and you acted on it. You checked it out and it worked out. I think a lot of people hold back, right? They're like, oh, that's an interesting article, but what if you dove into it? What if you pursued your curiosity? What if you opened yourself to looking a little further? And it's sort of like an expanding outline, like, okay, interesting. I'm gonna do some research. Oh, I'm gonna go to Tennessee. Oh, and then boom, boom, boom. It's like the outline keeps opening. You're like, man, I own over 300 acres in Tennessee. Yeah. And let's do a distiller. Now, fast forward, and I've got some other stuff. You've created a giant in the whiskey space.
Yes.
And it's hard to go from 0 to 100 in a space where you're competing. And I know Jack Daniel is supportive, from what I've read of the whiskey, but they've been around a lot longer than you.
Supportive would be a stretch.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe talk about that. It seems like they have, at least it's appearing on their website in a little bit.
So supportive would be a stretch. So you are conflating Uncle Nearest, the brand,
yes,
with the story of Jack and Nearest Green. They have updated all of their backstory, their brand story, to include how important Nearest Green was to their founding story. And that was the right thing to do.
I have seen that. Yes.
Absolutely. And so, but there is a leap from that to being supportive of us building a brand in the same space.
Okay. So I want to hear about that, because y'all, it's hard. Because
it's very difficult.
for people, just to summarize what I know about this industry is, you cannot just create a whiskey and grow, because they're distributors, there's lots of laws, and people like to drink stuff that they've all, like their grandparents did, and that they've been drinking their whole life, and get them to try something new. It's hard. And so you somehow have overcome or getting through a lot of these barriers. You could have started another kind of business that would have been maybe easier.
Yeah, basically every business would have been easier. We are the most regulated business in the United States. Right. We have a second tier. We are a 3-tier system. The second tier, which you mentioned, the distributors, are the most powerful tier in the industry. The supplier, which I am, which Jack Daniels is not the most powerful, nor is the consumer or those who sell the products. The most powerful group in our industry is the second tier. They determine what products will go where, how much, when. They determine the price point, they determine the margins, they are where the power lies. And we're the only industry where the maker cannot sell to the buyer. So even this used to be the case, for instance, with cars, right? The maker had to sell to a car dealer. That car dealer then sold to the consumer. But then you have someone like Elon Musk who comes along and says, hey, I'm not a car company, I'm a tech company. So I'm going to sell my Teslas on a cell phone. And he was able to get around that. There is no getting around the second tier in our industry. Even when people buy online, they assume, okay, surely that's coming from Uncle Nearest. No, in order to buy online, I had to sell to the distributor. The distributor then sells to a local retailer that ships the product for the e-commerce store, Reserve Bar, whoever else it is. So you literally have 4 different hands that have to buy into it before the consumer gets it, just in order for me to sell it online.
Yeah, so it's a maze. And what has been your approach or principles that has allowed you to, one, keep going? And you said you don't believe in stopping, right? You're not failing. If you don't basically, if you don't stop, you're not failing.
If you don't give up, you don't fail.
You don't give up.
You just keep going. And so that is my number one principle, is I deal with things every day that would take a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs out. That if it happened, some of the things I deal with in a single day, if it happened over the course of a year for an entrepreneur, for many of the entrepreneurs, would cause them to quit and go back to working for someone. And I deal with that kind of stuff every single day. And so I have to become so accustomed with how to handle challenges that the best way that I can explain it, and this analogy, I think, works even better because of the Olympics having just happened. If you take Noah Lyles and Sha'Carri Richardson, who are both so fast, and you put them on a track, I mean, I'd love to see them race against each other, number one. But you put them on a track, and they are just going to fly down that track to the finish line. But if you put hurdles in their way, they're going to be falling all over the place because they don't expect the hurdles. Now you give a hurdle to Cindy McLaughlin, and she's going to run faster doing the hurdles than they're going to run without any hurdles, because she's a hurdler. And so to be a really effective entrepreneur, you have to have the mindset of a hurdler. If you have the mindset of a person who simply runs, you will inevitably fall on your face, and it will be more difficult to get up. If you have the mindset of expecting the challenges every single day, but not focusing on the challenges. People like to always ask me, what's been your greatest challenge? What's been your greatest obstacle? I don't know. That's like asking a hurdler which one of the hurdles was the hardest. That's not what we're focused on. We're focused on the rhythm of our run and the jump
Interesting.
and what we need to do mindset wise so that muscle memory kicks in and we just get it done. But to sit there and focus on the challenge, even to talk about it, is foolish if you're a hurdler. I'm a hurdler.
Expect the hurdles, hurdle.
Mhm.
That's what you do. I like that. It's a real growth mindset. You're like, just another obstacle.
Yeah.
We keep going. We keep
Yeah.
going.
Doesn't make it easy. It's still hard, right? But
Well,
if you expect them, then
yeah.
you deal with them faster and they don't knock you out.
Yeah. Well, and so what are you doing to instill this in your team?
Oh,
Because you got a lot going on with them.
Yeah, I've surrounded myself with leadership that are hurdlers. I don't have any leaders that are expecting a clear track. Not a single one.
All right. So are you interviewing for that? Or are you?
Oh, so every leader that I have has been with me for quite a while. Most of them, my leadership team for the most part has been the same since the beginning. And so I've not had a lot of turnover in my leadership at all. And so they've been here from the beginning. Our company principles, our 10 guiding principles, they were a part of creating those. We did those collectively. And so as we've been hiring over the last 7 years since the company has been in market, we've hired according to those guiding principles. So one of the things that we did is number one, I brought everyone together to write our 10 guiding principles. What is going to make sure that as we continue to build this company, as we pass it to the next generation, that our founding guidelines, our founding principles don't get lost in this process? How do we make sure that this isn't something that, it goes up on a wall and is celebrated maybe once a year at some type of annual gathering, but it's really not a part of the core of who we are? This needed to be something that was visible, vibrant, that was a part of the fabric of this company. And so the way that we did that is once the 10 guiding principles were done, I created 10 corresponding hiring principles. And those hiring principles have a checkbox. And so the checkboxes, as people, whatever leader is looking at hiring a position, that those boxes, all 10 of them need to be checked. And even if a person is an absolute superstar, if one of those boxes aren't checked, that person never makes it to me. Because when that interview, by the time it gets to me, a person has been interviewed probably 3 or 4 times by the time it makes it to me, and I'm always the last interview. By the time it gets to me, every one of those boxes needed to be checked. But my job isn't to dive into their work history that's already been done, to dive into their philosophies and all the rest of that stuff. That was done on the way up to me. Yeah. When it comes to me, I'm just double checking that all 10 of those boxes have been checked. So that's how we've created our culture.
I like that. And a lot of leaders get stuck there because, like you say, they're like the second or third interview, and they haven't given themselves that gift of a framework to guide their team. So they end up unfocused and hard to make a decision. You've got those hiring principles. What are 1 or 2 of the hiring principles that maybe are some of the hurdles that people don't get over when they come into the organization?
We never stop learning. So if someone comes into it, first of all, if someone comes into an interview with me or with someone on my team and they're complaining about their last company, their last leaders, that's a red flag. Because if you are always learning, then what you're looking for in a situation like that was what could you have done better? Well, where could you have grown? Yeah. And so an immediate red flag is if someone comes in and they're complaining about everything the last company did wrong. And so that is against one of our hiring principles, this notion of we never stop learning. One of the other hiring principles that it corresponds with one of our guiding principles has to do with accepting everyone's differences. If you are looking for people to walk in lockstep with you, my company is not the company for you. My company is truly inclusive. If you're going to be a truly inclusive company, that means that you are listening to and respecting the thoughts of not just Democrats, but also Republicans and independents. It means that you are listening to people from every racial background, from every social economic background, from every religion that comes to the table, at least for the ones that in our company that drink. It might be hard if you come from a religion
Are there people that don't
know.
drink that work in your company?
No,
Okay.
That's my point.
Okay, about to say.
That's my point. Is that's about probably the only inclusion. Although
we have to draw the line
say,
somewhere.
I will say though, we have many people in our company that have become sober over the years, that they found that drinking led to drinking too much, which is against our company principles. We drink honorably. And so if someone is drinking and they're getting tipsy, or even Lord knows if they get drunk, in my company and other spirit companies, you won't get called out for that. In my company, you will. It goes against who we are. And so being sober minded, if a person finds during a certain period of life, it may be a stressful period of life. I have two people in mind that I'm thinking of. If it's a stressful period in life and they find themselves drinking too much, I'd rather them stop drinking altogether. They can still do their job and do it well and do it effectively. And so when a team member comes to me and says they've decided to be sober, I always cheer them on, because we need to know what our vices are, right? We're a country on drugs. Like, if you think about it, the number of people in this country that cannot function in the morning without caffeine, well, then that becomes your drug. If you cannot not drink caffeine without getting massive headaches, that has become an addiction. And we can kind of go down the line of, it might be sugar, it might be, there's so many things. And so even for myself, I tend to, anything that could be addictive, sugar, alcohol, whatever it is, that's caffeine, I will decide just to go cold turkey from it for a month, because I want to make sure that I don't have an addiction to anything. And so if someone in my company decides to do, I do it.
That's
I do
bold
it
in your industry, because your industry built on delicious whiskey, and which is addictive in some ways.
Yeah.
And some were, based on, it's interesting to think about how a founder, CEO of a whiskey company promotes sobriety, in moderation.
Yeah, I would say I actually support moderation. I believe in doing everything in moderation. But if you have an addictive personality at any point in your life, you need to honor that and understand, what? I need greater guardrails. I would love for every single person to be able to drink in moderation. I think it's just amazing to be able to sit. My husband and I last night, we were sitting and having a couple of drinks and just chit-chatting. And we do that very regularly. And when we're both in town, you can find us at night on a couch having a great conversation over drinks neat or cocktail. But we do it in moderation. And so I would love for everyone to have that experience. But if you have an addictive personality, I also support the need for you not to do that.
Yeah. Really a powerful message, to help people dial this in for themselves and be thoughtful about it. And I'm glad you mentioned having a drink with your spouse, because we literally had Uncle Nearest 1884 last night.
I love it. So good.
And y'all, smooth, fantastic. But I got to ask you, no pressure, but what's the best cocktail to be mixing this with? Because our people, our audience, right? They're at happy hour. They are taking clients out. And it makes a difference when you know the story behind what you're drinking and you can share it in a connected, cool way. And so,
listen, I love it neat. I love it on a single cube. But if you want it in a cocktail, if you're at a bar and Uncle Nearest is on the back bar, if it's the black label, the 1856, I'd say put that in a old fashioned all day long. That in an old fashioned is the ultimate old fashioned. It is so good. But if you have the label that you have, the cream label, the 1884, that swaps out most classic cocktails of other spirits. For instance, one of the best cocktails there is is an 1884, Uncle Nearest 1884 espresso martini. Swap out the vodka for 1884. You'll never go back to vodka again, by the way, if you do that in your espresso martini. The flavor profile is phenomenal. But for instance, if you are a cognac drinker and you like a sidecar, swap out the cognac for Uncle Nearest 1884. You will love that sidecar. If you love rum or you see a classic daiquiri on a menu, a classic daiquiri does not involve frozen anything, by the way. Classic daiquiri is served up. That means like in a coupe or without, served up just simply means without ice, and it's usually in a glass that has a stem. The classic daiquiri is one of my favorite drinks to order with Uncle Nearest 1884. It is, and the reason why I love sticking to the classics at bars is because most bartenders know how to make the classic. The classic for vodka, the classic for rum, the classic for cognac, the classic for tequila, a margarita with Uncle Nearest. So a lot of times I'll see it on the menu. It'll be, if they have some type of flavor profile, it might be a strawberry jalapeno or something that's creative. I'll say, I'll have that, but swap out the tequila for Uncle Nearest. They'll always look at me crazy. But then the bartenders put a straw in it and they'll taste it. And they're like, oh man, that's good. And so I tend to stick to, I see something on a menu in the cocktail section, and I tend to just take one of those cocktails and swap out whatever they were making it with Uncle Nearest. And I've never had that go wrong.
All right. That's a cool twist. Literally. I'm going to try that. Now we don't have a lot of time left, and I've got a million more questions. So we'll have to try to make this more compact here. I've got to ask you, one of only 5 African-American women to found and lead a $1 billion plus company in U.S. history.
Yeah.
What is that like?
That's something that I see on paper, but I don't really think much of that. That is, it is accurate, but I don't think anything of it, because for me, what we're building here, what we're building for the next generation, I've not even scratched the surface. My entire team has the same mentality. We're not even on the first floor yet. We're still trying to get from ground floor to first floor. And we're trying to do that in a 40-story building. And so a lot of people are celebrating us in a place that we feel like we're still in the lobby. We got a lot of floors to go. We got a lot of floors to build.
You're like, you ain't seen nothing yet, Ben. $1 billion is nothing.
Not close.
So I've also read, thinking about, a long way to go and sort of thinking about legacy. Is it correct that Uncle Nearest, his great-great-granddaughter, is the first African-American master distiller?
Master blender. She's 4-time Master Blender of the Year. When Whiskey Magazine gave that honor to her back to back, she became the first in history to receive that honor back to back. She is phenomenal. Whiskey is definitely in her blood, but it's the reason why Uncle Nearest is the most awarded bourbon and American whiskey in the world for the last 5 years in a row. It's about to be the 6th year in a row.
Holy cow. So it's just like you're winning on so many different fronts, one financially, one brand, and also honoring the legacy of the OG.
Absolutely.
All right. So I want to give you a word. You can play along with a game and just, what comes to mind. A marriage.
Love it. I think it's the greatest partnership of all time. If you get it right, if you choose right. Napoleon Hill, when he was doing his research for Carnegie and interviewing all of America's titans, and I think by the time it was all said and done, he had interviewed 500 American millionaires and titans back in that time. And what he found is that the number one indicator of whether or not a person would succeed in life and the level of success was based on the partner they chose. I chose a really good life partner. And so for me, marriage is the greatest partnership that was ever created.
And y'all, she wrote a New York Times bestselling book about that.
2 of them.
All right. Yes. So she nailed that one. All right. Motown.
Listen, Eddie Kendrick's Keep On Truckin', my favorite song of all time. And it's funny because my father was the writer and producer on that. And he saw mistakes in it. If you listen to Keep On Truckin', you only have, I think, maybe about 2 minutes of maybe 2.5 minutes of the song. There's actually any singing. Eddie Kendricks is singing. The entire additional, I don't know, 5, 6 minutes is literally a jam session. That's something that we would never do in this day and age. Just allow a jam session to continue and actually put it on the album. But what's so amazing is so when my father would listen to it, it would drive him crazy because he heard mistakes in it because that's not what it was meant to be. But I think it's one of the greatest songs of all time, probably because of all the mistakes that are in it.
Okay, I didn't expect you to take it that direction. That's cool.
Yeah.
And your father was a really well-established producer of Motown music, right?
He was writer and producer.
Had a magic ear for that.
He did.
Growing up in LA.
I'm not an LA girl. I have always been Southern at heart. My little sister remembers that when I would pick her up from high school, she said she was so embarrassed because I'd be blasting Garth Brooks, and we didn't exactly go to school in a neighborhood that Garth Brooks would have been played. But I've always, for whatever reason, I've always been Southern at heart. I thought that I would move to Texas. I have a lot of family in Houston. I thought I would move to San Antonio, Texas. I've loved that city my whole adult life, but I'm really happy that I landed in Shelbyville, Tennessee. But you could not pay me to move back to Los Angeles.
No offense to LA, but she's
no
not
offense
coming
to
back.
LA. I'm just a Southern girl at heart. And any person who lives in LA will tell you it is the furthest from a Southern city. Like there's nothing that is similar about Los Angeles, and pick any Southern city in the world. Although there's an argument that Nashville has turned into Nash Vegas, but even then, that's not Los Angeles.
All right. Your legacy.
I don't care about it.
Thank you. That's it.
Okay.
You did a great job. Fawn. So in all seriousness here, right at winding this up, take this any direction you want, but what's your parting thought for our listeners?
My parting thought would be live a life that has meaning. Don't be concerned about what people will think about you when you're gone. If you do that, then your entire life you're living for your obituary. Who cares? Let them sprinkle your ashes as far as your thought is concerned. Live a life that is truly meaningful, that means something to other people, but not because of what you might gain when you're dead, but because of what you're going to gain by doing that while you're still living.